to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Pennsylvania's budget is our topic today. You can join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001, or you can text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Katie Meyer from Spotlight, PA. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks for having me.
You filed a story about possible changes to cyber charter school funding. What's being proposed?
Sure. So this is a long time coming. What viewers might know that this comes up a lot. This year, there seems to be some real common ground, specifically on changing the way that cyber charter schools are both funded and overseen. So the kind of main components of this bill would be to change the funding formula. Right now, charter schools, all charter schools, brick and mortar and cyber, are funded based on the district where they are, based on their tuition per student. This would change it. It would put the cyber charters on a flat fee. It would be an $8,000 fee per student. And the idea there is that people who support this think that cyber charters are cheaper to run and so don't need all of that money that they've been getting from the districts. The other thing is that there would be a whole bunch of new oversight measures. Those would include things like making it so that cyber charters can't hold giant surpluses, very large surpluses of their funding. They have to cap it. And that idea is that some cyber charters, because of the money that they're receiving from districts, have been able to accumulate large surpluses and then do things that aren't very specific to the mission, like buying up properties. The other thing is that it would change the disability tier system for if a disabled student attends a cyber charter. Currently, there's just one disabled rate. This would create a tier system so that if you've got, for instance, a more minor disability like, mild autism, that would be on a different scale than something that's more severe, like, for instance, a child who's nonverbal. So those are the big things. But of course, the devil's always in the details, as every source I talk to about this likes to say. So it's still very much under negotiation.
Katie, you indicated that cyber charter schools have a history of being overfunded. So how did that happen in the first place?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think there's a lot of disagreement over what exactly the correct funding level is. But you're right in that there have been conversations about the funding level for a long time. So Pennsylvania's charter law, again, for all charter schools, brick and mortar or cyber, was drafted about 25 years ago. It's a pretty old law. And what it does is it creates a blanket policy for all charter schools where basically the student, wherever the student goes to school, whatever district that they live in, their tuition for a charter school is based on the tuition that public school district pays. And so it varies across the state. Public school districts in Pennsylvania, sort of famously in the education debate, have wildly different per student rates. But it's based on that. There are some deductions, but essentially the district then pays directly to the charter school for the cost of that child to attend another school option. And of course, charter schools, because of this funding system, they are also public schools, but they're overseen differently. And again, they're funded very differently from that pool of money that the district sends to charters. So the idea that you were getting at, like the fact that cyber charters are overfunded, cyber charters are a relatively new thing. And the use of them has ballooned since the pandemic. It's been really a sharp increase in the number of kids who go to them. And so folks have started looking at specifically the cyber charter law as saying, okay, well, because these schools are so different, because they operate so differently, there needs to be a different funding system. And there's some level of agreement on that. I think people know that, like, because this law wasn't written for cyber charters, again, broadly, they think that they need to do something to update it. The question is exactly what. And so that's what we're working on now.
So, Katie, when lawmakers get around to debating and voting this legislation that could change the way cyber charter schools are funded, what do you suppose the bone of contention will be?
Oh, I think there's going to be a lot of them. And I should say at this point, so this bill that would reform cyber charters, it doesn't just do that. It's a large education overhaul that the House Democrats have proposed. It also would increase funding for K through 12 basic education in public schools. By a lot, it creates a tier system that would put around $7 billion new dollars into $5 billion new dollars over 7 years into the public school system. So there's going to be a ton of bones of contention here. On the cyber charter issue specifically, I think the big question is going to be, what is that statewide rate for cyber charters? I think a lot of people who support the charter schools, Republicans who are more closely aligned with charter operators, Democrats in places like Philadelphia, where there are a ton of charters, they have generally seemed to want that rate to be a little higher. So I think that's going to be a big one. I think there's questions about the disability tiers and exactly how they should work. I think numbers are going to be the big bones of contention. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the question of what else gets into this bill, because they like to do very sweeping bills on education. And so I think there's going to be a lot in there.
Katie, you reported that the savings here could be up to about $500 million. If that's the case, what do you suppose will happen to that money? Are there any plans?
It's a good question. I think right now the name of the game in public education in Pennsylvania is putting more money into the public system. So all of this has really been jump-started by the fact that the Commonwealth Court last year handed down a ruling that said that Pennsylvania's public education system is inequitable, and so inequitable that it needs to be fixed. So the court ordered the legislature to come up with a fix to make the system more equitable. And so one of the things that they have generally agreed on is that one of the solutions to this is just going to be more money. They need to put more funding into the system, they have agreed. And that's Republicans, that's Democrats. I think there's broad agreement on that concept. Again, the question is how much? And so I think it stays in the system. I think basically what happens is that districts then hold on to it. It's not a pool of money that the state can control. It's money that stays in districts' pockets.
Last question, Katie. Do you suppose that this issue will flare up during budget negotiations?
Yes, I do. Everyone I've talked to says that education really is going to be the centerpiece of this year's budget. And that is my expectation. It's going to be a large component of the financial picture and also the policy picture.
All right. Thank you, Katie Meyer from Spotlight, PA. More PCN Capitol Preview after a short break. Welcome back. Our guests are Mark Singel, former PA Lieutenant Governor, and Jim Cawley, also a former PA Lieutenant Governor and currently the president of Rosemont College. Jim, we'll start with you. How would you characterize Governor Shapiro's state budget proposal for this year?
So let me start off by saying that anything I say today in no way reflects on Rosemont College. I'm not here as the president of Rosemont, but as a former lieutenant governor. And I think what we're seeing with the budget, and Mark, I don't know about you, but this administration has a situation that in the 4 years that Governor Corbett and I served, we did not. They actually are discussing excess revenues. We, during our 4 years, did not have such a situation. So really what it's boiling down to between the governor and the legislative leaders is what would be an appropriate spend on the almost $14 million now, adding in the rainy day fund and the budget surplus. Governor has proposed, I think, a very robust spending plan. Clearly, at least the Senate Republicans have passed a different version that had, in fact, bipartisan support on cutting taxes, both the income tax and a surcharge on electricity that's passed on to the consumer. So what I think we're going to see over the course of the next 3 weeks and perhaps beyond is a really in-depth discussion on how we spend what is the surplus, whether or not we return it to the taxpayer. I think it's the classic debate of who better to spend the money, the taxpayer who sends it there or the government that they send it to.
Mark, the figure I have for the proposal is $48.3 billion, and your general impressions.
It's a big number, and it's very interesting. You would think that we would be in a very simple position if you have $14 billion of excess funds to spend. But sometimes that complicates matters because everybody then develops their own pet wish list of spending. And you're right, Governor Shapiro, when he first proposed this, was very aggressive in pointing out things like workforce development, public safety, public transportation, education funding, which, by the way, we have to tackle because we're under a mandate from the Supreme Court. And anyway, he was talking about a very robust spending program, as you say. The Republicans came back and said, wait a second, if we've got $14 billion, let's give some of it back to the taxpayers. And hard to argue with that presentation. So here we are. The Senate has passed a version of tax cuts already with some Democratic support. And the House has passed its version of a historic $5 billion fix for public education with some Republican support. In my view, this is all very encouraging because there's some give and take going on already, and it seems to me that a compromise is at hand.
Now, as you indicated, the total surplus is $14 billion. Now, the governor is proposing, my understanding is, he's proposing to spend $3 billion of that. So given that figure, give us some perspective. Is $3 billion a lot of money in government spending, Jim?
$3 billion is a lot of money anywhere in Pennsylvania. And I think what the Republican perspective is on that $3 billion is it's a $3 billion spend this year on recurring costs that are going to have to come from somewhere next fiscal year, the year after that. And the concern is among Republicans that it's an unsustainable increase in that it will begin to eat into the rainy day fund. Everybody is ballyhooing the fact that our bond rating went up in the state. One of the main reasons why was because the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, cited good fiscal management and having those reserves. So what does that mean? That bottom line, that means anybody who knows that has a challenge with their own credit score, they know that their interest rate is going to be higher unless they have a better credit score, which means they're going to pay more money. If the state has a lesser credit score, they're going to pay more money. So among other things, eventually the bond rating will go back down. That'll cost more. And eventually that rainy day money will disappear, so the Republicans fear. And as such, the only way in which you're going to continue that spending is through tax increases, and that's why they've proposed an alternative plan.
So, Mark, what do you think? If the governor is proposing to spend $3 billion of that $14 billion total in reserves, will he necessarily go back to that well and keep drawing that money? That's what Republicans are worried about.
Yeah, and I think it's an unfounded fear on the part of the Republicans, because what Shapiro has done is costed things out and focused on investments that provide a good ROI, a good return on investment. And we can afford that $3 billion at the moment, right? And it does not have to be recurring, because hopefully it generates the kind of increases in tax revenues. If you're putting money into road development, for example, you open up all kinds of economic opportunities. If you're putting money into workforce development, you're providing a better workforce that in turn benefits business, that increases the income for the state. So the whole point is, in Shapiro's version, is invest in Pennsylvania and enjoy the return. The Republicans, on the other hand, are saying, okay, that's fine, except let's be careful about this because you don't want to overspend. This is one of those rare situations where they're both right.
And when budgets are being made, gentlemen, and especially in your day as lieutenant's governor, how often did the surplus be a factor in the total budget proposal?
In our 4 years, zero. I would say this.
I'm trying to get a baseline on how much we rely on that.
I would tell you that we had hopes of a more robust economy during our time there than ultimately it turned into being. Of course, Governor Corbett and I came to Harrisburg right after the Great Recession, the 2008 dip. And unfortunately, the economy did not recover. I think one of the reasons why, let's be honest, one of the reasons why the Commonwealth's in the situation it is because of the COVID money. because, frankly, inflation has gone up, so tax revenues have gone up. And far be it from me to quibble with my friend Mark, but I think that there is concern about whether or not the $3 billion as proposed by the administration is sustainable. And I think that, again, going back to what I had said earlier in the opening, with some reserves, not the rainy day fund, which is prescriptive into how it can be spent, and is there exactly for what it says, a day in which it rains, in which there certain services of government need to be continued. The $3 billion in excess revenue, I think the question is, at a time in which there are challenges for average Pennsylvanians, are we going to send it back to them, the folks that sent it to us in the first place, so that they can put money in their pocket? Or are we going to continue to spend in a way in which at least Republicans are concerned that we're not going to be able to sustain that level of spending?
So relying on a surplus, in your view, Mark, is not exactly the normal, at least when you were Lieutenant Governor?
It's rarely the normal. As I recall, we had a slight surplus in our first year of the Casey Singel administration, and then found ourselves, because of changing economic times, like you did, there was a drop after the fourth year in the national economy, and we found ourselves having to recover and having to raise taxes, for which we were pretty excoriated at the time. But
you
overall,
raised taxes? I didn't.
It was brutal. It was brutal. People still say it was the Casey Singel tax. I don't know. The lieutenant governors don't get credit for anything unless it's a tax
but
increase.
the blame, right? Exactly. Don't get the credit, but certainly get the blame.
But the whole point is that we did what we had to do to stabilize the economy and so on. And I think managed Pennsylvania's resources quite well, and the bond ratings went up, and we were on firm, solid ground when we left it to our successors.
Viewers, we'd like you to call 1-877-PA65001, or you can text us at 717-219-4001. We're talking about Governor Shapiro's current budget proposal with former lieutenants governor here in Pennsylvania. Now, let's continue to zero in on the specific things that could be funded in this budget, gentlemen. And it seems like every day there's another article that acknowledges the importance of public school funding, and also often brought up in the same breath is a court ruling that came up that found school funding inequities in Pennsylvania. So how did this court ruling set the stage for this year's budget, Jim Cawley?
Well, certainly the decision of the court is, I think, something that is in everyone's mind, both the administration and legislative leaders. The Republican position, and in fact, I think it's borne out in reading the opinion, doesn't direct that a certain amount of money must be spent. It recognizes an inequity. And there has been a great deal of discussion about what that inequity is and how best to fix it. The Republican position is year over year, there have been increases in public education, but yet test scores continue to go down, and there hasn't been an improvement of the system. What the Republicans are talking about is saying, wait a minute, rather than trying to figure out how much more money we can send to public education, let's first see if there is a way in which we can fix the system, where we can make it more equitable by making it even more efficient, merit pay for teachers, among other things, and ways in which we can focus on fixing the whole system. And as such, if that requires additional investment, I have not heard the Republicans say that they would be opposed to that. They just want to first continue to look at and focus on, as they have in the past, how we can make it better before we put a great deal more money into a system that right now has a lot of challenges.
And the court ruling really didn't provide any detail on suggesting a remedy, did it?
No, they didn't at all. The Constitution requires only that education administration in Pennsylvania be thorough and efficient. And the court simply said, the system right now is not thorough and it's not efficient because there are school districts that are not getting their fair share. It's not equitable because it's spread unevenly throughout the Commonwealth. And they're right. Every year we go through the ESB formula for education, and whoever seems to be in power is able to gather more of the resources and put it into their districts, and that's just not right. So I think the courts got it right, but they didn't give us any guidance at all. Fortunately, there's been a lot of work done since that time, and just yesterday, the House passed an historic adjustment that basically implements what Shapiro is asking for over the next 7 years, about $5 billion worth of adjustment. So that's about what it's going to take to get us back to equitable.
Here's a phone call from Clearfield, Pennsylvania, and it's Robert. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. You know, panelists, I realize that you're no longer serving in Pennsylvania government. You can't really speak for members of the legislature. But something that comes to mind here, and that is, if you have these surpluses, why aren't the members of the legislature focused on simply doing what their constituents are trying to do, is try getting out of debt? If there are certain instruments of debt, and this is Pennsylvania holds, and if they are callable, why not just call them in, pay off the debts, and try to get those out of the way going forward? Because, yeah, right now times are fairly good, but it could be good today and bad tomorrow. So why not focus on debt reduction?
Well, I always think that's a good idea, and I think Pennsylvania does that every year. As a matter of fact, the capacity for Pennsylvania to borrow is still an additional $10 billion or so because of our credit rating and because of our ability to balance the budget every single year. So while Pennsylvania has debt, it's manageable, much like you have a mortgage on your house. It's not necessary for you to go tomorrow and pay the entire $350,000 that's left, but you can absorb the cost of your mortgage on a monthly basis. And I think Pennsylvania is doing that in a rational way.
And I think, too, again, what I had said earlier about the bond rating, again, that's our credit rating, and what it costs the taxpayers, you and I, in order to pay back what it is that's borrowed by the state. With a good credit rating, one that recognizes fiscal management that includes keeping an appropriate surplus, we're able to access money more cheaply. And I would say as well that not familiar with all of the programs and all of the debt that the state currently has. I suspect that there may be a situation in which at least one or two of those we could even with our improved bond rating today, with the economy as it is, I'm not sure we could get a better debt rate interest rate on that debt. So I think Mark is right that we need to constantly monitor our debt, do so responsibly, and where there are places where there is a savings to be had, I have the feeling that state government is looking at that all the time because, again, as Mark and I remarked at the beginning, there is often a look toward getting more money so that they can be spent in other areas, as Mark said, pet projects. So I don't think that there's anybody who would be shy about paying off debt if that meant that it would mean more in the coffers to be reassigned to other areas. But as I said as well, I think the Republicans are looking at ways in which they're trying to drive it back to the individual taxpayer. And I think the administration and the Democrats in the legislature are looking for ways in which they can invest it in other areas.
We started a discussion about education funding, and before we get any deeper into it, let's consider what Commonwealth Court said. They said that relying on property taxes to fund public education creates inequity. And talk about that for a minute, Mark Singel.
Oh, I agree with that completely. The most onerous tax in Pennsylvania today remains the property taxes. And this is after 50 years of discussions and debates and how do we curtail it and how do we reduce it. Gaming was supposed to reduce property taxes significantly, and it did to a certain degree. But still today, property taxes are the principal means by which we fund local schools, and it's the wrong thing to base it on, because it's regressive. I mean, people are stuck with that burden. It doesn't matter if your income is low, if you have property, you still have to pay that burden. So it's disproportionately affects the elderly in Pennsylvania. So the one thing that was in this package that passed yesterday was $1 billion of property tax relief. So that's one of the first major steps we've moved in this direction. I think it's a good one.
So property tax certainly is an antiquated notion. It's one that says he or she who owns property has money. And perhaps that was the case at one point, but along comes the American dream. I grew up in Levittown, the quarter acre to folks returning from World War II. And that's really no longer the case. But before we throw out the property tax, we have to recognize one thing. There is an enhanced level of accountability with local property taxes in that those in their community elect their own school board who ultimately decide on what the local property tax. There are two bills, I understand, because we finance local municipalities and counties on it. But what we're really talking about is the property tax that goes to education, because that's, at least in my house, that's what we call the big bill. And when it comes to the big bill, there is a realization among the taxpayers, there is an accountability as to who it is and how it's being raised. And through the electoral system, there is a remedy to that if the taxpayers are simply at a point that it's beyond their ability to support what the increases are. So I think that there is a better way. I think we all have to work together to find it. I'm not here today to propose that there is a better way exactly, or what that better way is, I should say. I am proposing there is a better way. But right now we also have to recognize the fact that there is a level of accountability that we don't want to lose while we're transferring any potential revenue sources for education.
Now, the governor is proposing an increase for education that amounts to about $1.1 billion. And I think the question on everyone's mind is, how can this funding be directed to the schools that need it the most?
Well, I think that's the question that the legislature tries to address every year. And we have 501 school districts, and it is unwieldy, to say the least. Who's spending it wisely, who isn't spending it correctly, and that kind of thing. And it's very hard to get to those answers, because each of those school districts has the authority and the autonomy to govern themselves, which is the way it should be. But there are certain basic requirements that should be in place. And I think the $1 billion that he's talking about, which, by the way, is every year for the next 5 years, in order to get us closer to that thorough and efficient mandate. I think that what that's designed to is to fill the holes and to patch the inequities, to address the shortcomings. And much of that will come from the school districts themselves. They will tell the legislature what they need, and the legislature will respond and say, we either have the money for that or we don't, and we'll have to negotiate with them.
I think the question and Mark's comments are the very crux of what the legislature and the governor are going to be spending time talking about over the next several weeks. The thought that thorough and efficient can be achieved by investing more money, or thorough and efficient can be achieved by getting into the system and recognizing the fact that there are shortcomings in the system and that they need to be fixed. The belief among the executive, the governor, and the legislative Democrats is that that can be solved by investing more money. As Mark said, $5 billion. Again, feeding into the concern about sustainable investment, whereas the legislative Republicans are saying, wait a minute, let's take a look at what it is we're spending money on before we spend more.
And that leads me to think of student performance, because after all, they say education funding is up, but test scores are down.
Well, that's exactly the point. And the other thing, too, as somebody who spends a fair amount of time in higher ed, we're constantly reminded by all sorts of different entities that we in higher education are facing a population cliff, that there are going to be less college-age, traditional-age college students coming to us just in a couple of years. Well, right now, those same students are working their way through elementary and secondary schools. And the question then becomes, if there's a lesser population, where is this need for more money? Why is it that there's constantly a need for more money? And is it, in fact, affecting the classroom experience?
Mark Singel and Jim Cawley, thank you very much. We're going to give you a break for a minute while we look at program notes for PCN. On the issues has former presidential candidate Andrew Yang talking about the candidates in November's general election that the Forward Party hopes to have on the ballot. He'll be here on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Right after that program, Representative Paul Schemmel gives his views on efforts to decriminalize marijuana in Pennsylvania. That's at 7:30 p.m. The 2024 PIAA softball and baseball championships will be live on PCN Thursday and Friday. Then on Saturday, watch live coverage of the 2024 PIAA lacrosse and boys volleyball championships. For details, go to PCNTV.com. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free on the internet. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. And we're talking about the governor's budget proposal with former lieutenant's governor here in Pennsylvania. And the $1.1 billion increase that we've been talking about, how will that be distributed? In other words, since it's new funding, does that mean it's going to go through this so-called new funding formula that was put together a few years ago?
Don't know the answer to that. I think Jim's right. The intense discussions that are going on right now and over the next 2 weeks, we'll have to find a creative way to distribute this funding because they cannot be tied to the SB formulas of the past, elementary and secondary basic education funding, because that was inadequate. So this is going to have to kind of take a whole new paradigm that distributes money in a more effective way. And by the way, I don't disagree at all with the notion that we've got to make sure that what we're spending is productive. It really is not just a matter of throwing more money at things. This has got to be focused in a way that we understand what we're getting in return for that investment.
A significant chunk of what the governor proposed, I think, is part of this new iteration of funding, as Mark talked about. There is a certain piece that goes into the SB formula, as is historically been the case. The vast majority, to my understanding of what the governor's proposal is a new system of driving the money to the school districts. I don't know. I think Mark is absolutely right. That is, if any of that is to survive budget discussions, that will be something that I'm sure will be hotly discussed as well as to what, if any, of the money would come in a new formula over and above the SB formula.
And speaking of hotly discussed, about a year ago, the subject of school vouchers for private and religious schools came up. And there was a debate, and there was some kind of an agreement, apparently, between lawmakers and Governor Shapiro. But something happened to derail that arrangement. Can you tell us briefly what it was?
There was a miscommunication, shall we say. The governor thought that he had the approval of his caucus to make a deal with the Senate Republicans on some version of scholarship programs that pass is what it was called at the time.
Right.
It was a way to enhance funding for folks from underserved areas and things like that. And Governor Shapiro kind of said, I'm interested in this. He wasn't embracing the notion of tuition vouchers per se, but said, look, we can work something out along that line. And the Democrats in the House were having none of it. So they shut that door down, and it was a little bit embarrassing because he had to pull back from his original support and sign the budget without any of that. He had to veto that part of the budget.
And he's a Democrat too, just like the lawmakers who opposed him in the House.
That's correct. But here's the thing. That has reared its head again, and the Republicans, particularly in the Senate, are saying, all right, let's get back to this. You know, we still believe that if it's not some kind of a voucher program where the money follows a student, at least some kind of a scholarship program that we can all agree on. And I think they may get something like that this year, because that is going to be part and parcel of the education debate.
So I'm not sure that Senate Republicans would necessarily agree that Governor Shapiro dipped his toe in the water. I think they felt he was a little more immersed in a commitment, and I do think that Mark's right that there was, be generous and describe it as a miscommunication with leaders in the House of Representatives. The money following the student is not something new in Pennsylvania. We've been doing it for years. It's called FIA. And higher education allows for that sort of choice for people. And I think the concept of allowing choice and allowing the consumer, the student, the parents, to make the decision is very similar to what we already have in the higher education realm. So I think that there will be more discussion on that. It's hopeful that this time, if there is an agreement, that's an agreement that will see the light of day and will actually become the law of the land. And I am mindful of, during my time as lieutenant governor, I remember somebody saying, and this is somewhat different, but it also goes to the whole education discussion that we're talking about, charter schools, that if you put all the charter schools in the Commonwealth together, they would represent, by student population, the largest school district in the Commonwealth. You know what the second is? Those on the waiting list to get into charter schools. So clearly, when given an opportunity, those that are being served by the currently existing system are saying, we'd like to find other ways in which to seek an education for our child, and some in certain situations saying for myself. And I think that that's why this discussion is going to be so robust over the next few weeks.
Well, and let me just say this: that is the positive presentation about tuition vouchers and charter schools and so on. But let me point out that over the course of the last 30 years or so, it has run into opposition for one simple reason, and that is because those involved with public education today are concerned that that would divert resources from making public education excellent. It's like you're giving up and saying, look, we can just take money out of the system, put it into new tuition voucher programs, or invest in charter schools, and things are going to just automatically get better. It doesn't really work that way. There are enhancements. There are certainly charter schools that operate beautifully in the state, but if what you do is cripple our public education system by diverting resources, you're not achieving anything.
Jim Cawley, is there a way to fund these vouchers by not taking money away from traditional public schools?
Well, there most certainly is. And the reality is it's not some sort of laissez-faire, just we're going to make a change and assume it all goes to plan. Any system, I should say, not both systems, are going to be accountable. And they're going to help the Commonwealth to what its constitutional mandate is, to be thorough and efficient. Because right now, you need not take the Republicans' word for it, the legislative Republicans, or even my word for it. We have a judge who said, you're not hitting the marks. And this is after years and years and years of continuing down the same road. So in that very definition of insanity, continuing to do the same thing and expect a different result. I think what the legislative Republicans are saying is it is time, it is past time for us to explore different ways in which we can provide that thorough and efficient education.
Republicans are proposing a reduction to the personal income tax. And Mark Singel, what's your impressions of trying to do that?
Well, as I said at the beginning, it's hard to argue with the notion that if we are the stewards of public monies and we have extra money, that we shouldn't give some of it back. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but that makes sense to me. The question is that the right approach at this moment, or would we be better served to invest that money into better schools for our kids, our highway systems, training programs, public safety, that kind of thing. So it's a classic kind of discussion between Democrat and Republican philosophies. Do you invest more or do you return some of the money? And to be honest with you, right here and now, on this date, as this budget is being debated, I say there's a compromise. I say we can meet in the middle and get this done in a relatively short order and a reasonable fashion for the taxpayers.
So certainly I think that recognizing the fact that by very definition, a representative democracy, a republic that we live in, necessitates compromise. It is the way in which the system works. So certainly without, of course, compromising principle. There's always room for discussion in order to advance the state itself and in the interests of the Commonwealth. But what I think ultimately the question is exactly what Mark said. Who better to spend the money? The people that sent it to Harrisburg in the first place, or government? And at a time in which $20 at a grocery store doesn't go anywhere near what it used to in buying groceries just a few short years ago, or gasoline in some cases costs an awful lot more than it did a few short years ago, allowing the taxpayers to have that money in their pocket to be able to decide in the way in which they see fit, as it is their money, I think is the appropriate course that the legislative Republicans are proposing in what it is that they will continue to discuss over the next few weeks.
Now, the current personal income tax rate is 3.07%, just to give some perspective to this discussion. So I wonder how much of a reduction is being discussed.
They were talking about 2.89.
Going back to the old number.
Yeah, I think it's 2.89, which really doesn't sound like a lot, but it does amount to about $1.2 billion that's returned. And the utility tax surcharge is another 1.2. So they're talking about a $3 billion return to the taxpayers, which is not insignificant. And here's the other thing, switching to my political persona for a while.
Have at it.
When the Republicans first announced the tax cut, they really created a situation where we're not going to be able to ignore it. Because if, in fact, we get through this budget cycle and there is no reduction in taxes, then I guarantee you that's going to be a campaign issue all over Pennsylvania in November. Very clever, in my view, on the part of Joe Pittman and the Republicans to draw that line in the sand and say, here's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to cut taxes, and then we're going to talk to you about investments, Governor Shapiro. So I think that you're going to see some reduction, but maybe not the whole amount that they're looking for.
And to that end, the Post-Gazette, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, ran an editorial, to my understanding, a couple of days ago that suggested at least that the Republican plan certainly deserves its day in court, if you will, and might be a better way to go. They cautioned, again, to what Mark just said, that perhaps taking it from 3.07 to 2.8 or 2.89, whatever the number was that's proposed, that maybe you want to do that incrementally and perhaps do less. But the good news, I think, for the taxpayers, at least from the Republican legislative perspective, is that's now on the table, and in the realm of the political. I think that Mark, your comments are borne out by the fact that the governor didn't say this is a proposal that I cannot consider, or it wasn't any bravado of being DOA. It was I welcome them to the table, which suggests that okay, I get it. The administration, the governor get it, and we are going to have this discussion as well, one on tax reduction.
And one real quick point to that. The other nuance to that at this stage of the budget discussions is when the House passed its historic education funding piece, whatever you want to call it, that was not rejected out of hands by the Senate Republicans either. If you will notice, the language that all parties are using at the moment is pretty conciliatory, pretty welcoming, and that's unusual for this time of the budget season.
Let's consider another possible tax reduction that's being discussed recently. In addition to lowering personal income tax, there's also talk of eliminating something called the gross receipts tax. This is on electricity service, and the story is it could save a family of $400 a year. I wonder if that's going anywhere.
Well, that's the $1.8 billion piece of the $3 billion back to the taxpayers, and that was thrown into the deal. And you know, let's be honest about it. If you're adding a tax to a utility's gross receipts, you're taxing the consumer because they're just going to pass it on to you anyway. So with that reality in mind, I do think that you're going to get at least a portion of that done this year.
And you're, again, the gross receipts tax, an ancient tax dating back to the 1800s, Mark's exactly right. It is, in fact, passed on, and all of us see it because it's on our bill as a surcharge. And the relief that one would get, particularly in an area that we're seeing increase in expense, energy. How much it costs to heat or cool our homes, in seeing some relief there, I think is a proposal that will carry some merit as well.
So we have about 2 minutes left in our program, gentlemen. So let's reflect on what kind of progress has been made on budget negotiations so far.
From my perspective, so far so good. And unfortunately, the public doesn't really see all of the activity behind the scenes. But when it does express itself in a press conference by the governor or the caucuses in the House and the Senate, at this point in the proceeding, it's normally a lot more hostile, I have to say. So what I'm hearing are people who understand the other side's perspective and understand the blunt reality of counting heads to get to the votes. So I'd say at this point on June 11th that I'm cautiously optimistic that they're going to come to a decent budget, maybe not on time, but close.
So Jim Cawley, you're not immersed in it like you used to be, but what do you think?
I think the cake is certainly not baked yet, and there is a great deal of ground still to cover. I do think, as well as Mark has said, that there is progress that we are seeing, the public is seeing. A lot will come down to what happens around that budget table in the governor's office. But it also, I think, let's face it, everyone would like an on-time budget. I'm sure that that is very much a desire of the legislature and certainly the governor. But I don't have a sense that either side in the negotiations or the multiple sides in the negotiations are married to it must be on time. I think that they would rather make sure that they have a quality product that they can endorse and be comfortable with.
Our guests have been Mark Singel, former PA Lieutenant Governor, and Jim Cawley, also a former PA Lieutenant Governor. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
PCN's Ellen Franz talked to Representative Rob Matzie about rail safety.
Welcome to our program. What inspired you to propose this bill?
Well, after the unfortunate disaster in East Palestine, just over the Pennsylvania border, really brought all of this to the forefront. And we started to examine and look at what we could do from a state's perspective. We had a joint policy hearing in Darlington Township, which abuts the Ohio line, and the Senate had a couple of hearings as well. We felt the time was right, and that's the main reason we put forth the bill to ensure that we had something in place that made sense.
How would this bill make railways safer?
Well, we believe, train length was a big issue with this, in my humble opinion. They had to put an engine in the middle of the train, even to get up a hill. Our bill would mirror what other states are doing or have done and make it 8,500 feet from a length perspective. And if you think of 26 football fields, that's 8,500 feet. So it's still pretty large from that perspective. But that was a big issue. The wayfinding part of it, putting in more wayfinding detectors in closer proximity to one another was a big issue from a safety perspective. The federal government's been talking, and there have been some executive actions, but nothing's been done from a statute perspective. We believe we have that right as a state to do that.
The railroad has been around for a while, and as technology, increases over the years, the railroad has become run a different way. When was the last time Pennsylvania has updated their railway safety legislation?
Well, quite frankly, we don't have any. And from that perspective, there are some things under the Department of Transportation's purview. The Public Utility Commission has some purview as it pertains to crossings and right-of-way issues. But from a pure safety perspective, it's gone through the federal government, through either transportation or the railway safety. We, however, believe because of a federal court case allowing states to interject to ensure that safety is paramount and a part of what's their purview is the reason why we felt we can get this bill across the finish line.
You mentioned the federal government. To what extent does the state government have involvement in railway safety versus the federal government?
Well, the argument from those that are against my proposal is that the Federal Railroad Administration or the National Transportation Safety Board or the Department of Transportation at the federal level has jurisdiction and the states do not. There was a court case that came through several years ago that dictated that they can adopt or continue enforce an additional or more stringent law, regulation, or order related to railroad safety or security when the law, regulation, order is necessary to eliminate or reduce an essentially local safety or security hazard, or it is not incompatible with a law, regulation, or order of the United States government. That's the impetus for us even proceeding. If we felt that there was nothing we can do, we weren't about to do a dog and pony show. We feel we have teeth, and it's something that passed in a bipartisan manner in the House.
Is there a part of this bill that references, whatever the train is carrying, is there a part of the bill that ensures that if the train were to derail, that whatever it's carrying does not fall off and injure the surrounding environment or the people who live in the area that it derailed?
Well, that was one of the issues from the perspective of East Palestine. It took several hours before emergency responders, first responders, even knew what chemicals they were dealing with. This piece of legislation would play a role relative to ensuring that we knew exactly what was on these trains. So if in fact a disaster happened, these are going to continue. We still will have derailments. That's just reality. And you still do have accidents that occur. But for our first responders not to have any idea what they're dealing with, it puts not only them in jeopardy, but also the environment.
Last question, where is this bill in the legislative process now?
Well, it passed the House in a bipartisan manner. Passed out of committee on May 3rd, passed by the House on June 5th. 39 Republicans joined the Democrats 141 to 62. So it's in the Senate. We had mixed signals early on relative to whether or not the Senate would do anything. We were hoping for at least a hearing, I'm not going to lie. And it seemed like we were going in that direction. But the longer we get away from what happened in East Palestine, it's becoming pretty clear that the lobbying effort being made to try and defeat this is working, and the Senate has nothing scheduled to bring this up.
Representative Rob Matzie, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Before we go, here's a reminder for you. On the Issues has former presidential candidate Andrew Yang talking about the candidates in November's general election that the Forward Party hopes to have on the ballot. He'll be here on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Right after that, Representative Paul Schemmel gives his views on efforts to decriminalize marijuana in Pennsylvania. That's at 7:30 p.m. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.